something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Before the main discussion today, I want to thank all of our Patreon subscribers for their support. If it weren't for all of you, we would not be able to do this. If you are not a subscriber, you are missing out on hundreds of hours of content which illuminate the organized criminal entity that is the U.S. Empire. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Charles Derber, it's great to have you back with us.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks for having me back.
It's my pleasure, and I'm really happy to be able to discuss with you your new book, which is going to be published soon, as I understand it. And the book
it's out already.
It's out already. Okay, good. We will put a link to it in the show notes.
Good.
The book is Bonfire, and it is about Socioside. Can you explain the Bonfire title and what Socioside is?
Yes. Well, Socioside, Aaron, sounds a little bit like suicide, and it's about the suicide of society, the sort of self-destruction of what makes a society possible. The Bonfire title, I don't know if you have a copy. I'll show you the book. Hold on. So the book has a picture of a young person just being burned up by a bonfire. The word bonfire originally came from a British expression which means the burning of the bones. And in this case, we're talking about the bones of society, the things that hold a society together. And that, of course, is social relationships in order to have a society rather than just individuals, walking randomly in the night. You need to have a form of social cohesion and kind of a sense of connection among individuals so that there's some sense of a collectivity rather than purely individual, atoms floating around in space. There's a famous book, Aaron, called The Mountain People. It's about the Ik, who was a tribe in Uganda, and they were displaced from their native area in the country and put in a mountain region where there was really hardly any food to survive. And what happened was a famous anthropologist, Colin Turnbull, wrote a book about them, which is sort of a metaphor for the book that I've written in a way in regard to Socioside, because in the mountain people, there was he called them the loveless culture. And what he meant by that was that these were individuals that simply had no ability to have a feeling to think about other people, care for them. They had to be 100% focused on themselves. So, for example, if you and I were living in that society, Aaron, and we were friends or brothers, and I had to go out and find some food to help you survive because you were sick, I couldn't do that. I would only be thinking about myself and getting my own food. And there was a reason for that, because if I had enough caring for you that I wanted to get food to protect you, I would die that day. The food was so scarce and the competitiveness for that food was so intense that the conditions made it essential that each person focus entirely on themselves and their own survival. And there was no sense of care or connection. The anthropologists, people would come up and tell lies about their wife being sick or their kids being sick for money and then just go get it for themselves. So That's a society in deep sociocide. The society has broken apart. The relationships, that the bones of the society have eroded. And you have, rather than any sense of a collective identity or a community, there's simply atomized individuals who are trying to survive. And while obviously we're not a society starving in quite the same way, even though about 1 out of every 4 children in America is hungry, we are a society that have long been focused on the individual as against the collectivity. We're very distinctive from, say, European societies where there's a strong sense of the collective, a culture of community. America has always been marked by a kind of hostility to the idea that anything collective, particularly the government, is seen as a form of coercion. This was heavily developed by the economist Milton Friedman, who argued that, neoclassic economics recognizes that government is by its nature coercive. It constrains the individual from freely pursuing their interests in the marketplace. And so this is not a new phenomenon in America, the idea that we're a society that has weak or broken relationships. But I argue in this book that we've evolved into particularly since the neoliberal globalized economy of the Reagan era and beyond, that sort of sociopathic kind of individualism has evolved or morphed into a more extreme sociocidal society. And a lot of the book shows data. This involves most obviously in the workplace, the new robber barons in Silicon Valley and in private equity. It's obviously in the end, when you have a society that's deeply unequal, it's very dangerous for elites to allow solidarity or connections to develop among workers or the public. And so we've had, I sort of document over the last 40 years, the breakdown of unions and connections in the workplace and the legal character of employment relationships here in the United States, which have moved toward essentially, the robber barons of the early Gilded Age. They were very exploitative and sociopathic, but they developed, a physical workplace where people could gather. And Marx believed that the saving grace of capitalism was it created spaces where workers could get together, because before capitalism emerged, people worked at home or in their fields and they didn't have strong connections at work. Capitalism created this kind of environment where people were brought together in a social space where they could develop some sort of collective sense of identity and resistance. That's been torn apart. And in the modern age, the two richest people in the world, Musk and Bezos, have come together with Trump to sue, to argue that the 1935 Wagner Act, which first legalized unions in America, was unconstitutional. So there's a very strong effort to make unions, and we, in contrast to Europe, where about 75% of workers are in unions, in the United States, do you know, Aaron, what percentage of the private sector labor force is in unions?
I wouldn't even, I would guess maybe 10%, but I'm not, that's
about true for the country as a whole. Most of it's public sector. Private sector is about 5%. It's just eroding completely. And you can tie that to changes in the nature of employment and the physical space. So, AI and, the internet is allowing work to be more remote. Some people like that, but it has the characteristic of sort of breaking down a collective physical workspace so that people are more scattered and diverse when they work. Plus, about 60 to 70% of American employment is moving toward or at kind of temp or gig or independent contractor or other forms of legal relationships, which are sort of understood to be transient and temporary and weak and breakable. So that's one whole area where sociocide, that is the breaking of relationships which hold people together and give people a sense of solidarity, is being undermined. And I show in the book that there are a range of other things going on. For example, with social media and the way Silicon Valley is reconstructing our relationships online through a kind of logarithmic wiring that is controlled. You go to Palantir and you see that you have one company that's assembling a database for everybody in the country, and kind of the Silicon Valley folks, who are the richest folks in the world right now, are reconstructing the nature of our social communications with each other. So my students, for example, tell me, at the college, that they spend about 4 or 5 hours, 6 hours a day on, TikTok or Instagram, but they have very little trust in. They don't know who the influences are. They don't really, if they have friends, and many of these people do not have a lot of friends. Many, I know a very growing percentage of Americans eat all their meals alone. There's just a whole bunch of data, which I document in the book, which shows that these, the things that we think of as sort of fundamental to community and to society are, catastrophically eroding. The Surgeon General of the United States wrote a report back last year called The Loneliness Epidemic in America, which is about the breakdown of relationships. And this is all very fundamental in relating to the rise of our current political crisis and authoritarianism. The book is really about how this breakdown of social relationships is a classic foundation of authoritarianism and fascism. And so much of the book is exploring the relationship between these changes in the way we connect with each other, the strength of the social cohesion in the society, which has become very, very weak. And by the way, just one other thing I want to add, which I learned in studying this, the greatest part of the population, other than much older people, who are most vulnerable to this pattern are working class people. I would have thought the opposite. There's sort of an image that, upper middle class people, the college kids are going, or, professionals, they're more individualistic. They're more likely to be individualistic than traditional working class folks. It's not the case. Actually, social connections have been most eroded among non-college working class people. Part of the thing is that they're in what I call civic deserts. That is, they live in parts of the city where there aren't the kind of public spaces, whether it's parks, public gardens, museums, cafes, things where people can get together to socialize and so forth. This kind of connection, by the way, is called off by some people who study these things, social capital. We know what financial economic capital is. We have a crisis of economic capital in the United States because 60% of American workers are in this socially precarious position, but they also say they're living paycheck to paycheck, one lost job, and they fear that they can go into poverty or be broke. They're also experiencing a crisis of not only of money capital, but of social capital. Their connections, they live in civic deserts, areas where, whether, it has to do with, neighborhood associations, churches even, all of these things are eroding that traditionally brought people together. And so it's important to say that the book is really looking at the sort of intersection of an economic crisis where we have the biggest inequality in American history, and where most working people are in a very economically precarious situation, and that's intertwined and overlaid with a social crisis of social capital. People are not only devoid of economic capital, but are in a crisis of social capital, which is what I'm talking about with Socioside, where people don't have, many people, not all, but where many people don't have the kind of social capital or social relationships. I'm talking here about friendships, family relationships, neighborhood relationships, and so forth, that give them a sense of safety and a feeling they can trust other people and feel that somebody has their back. So the book really documents this and then goes into considerable argument about how these are classic, when people are afraid because they lack basic connections with other people. And so they don't trust other people. They're fearful. And this is connected with major economic insecurity, which is overlaid with this problem of social insecurity among the working classes. It is the absolute characteristic that's always given rise to authoritarianism and to fascism. This was true in the 30s in Germany and other European societies when we had another era of global authoritarianism. And so these underlying economic and social conditions, in my judgment, and I try to argue this carefully in the book, although it's written for the general public and it's a very easy book to read. It's very personal because everybody can think about their own life situation and how both these economic and social capital, shapes your own experience. But what it leads to is authoritarianism and militarism, because there's nothing like a good war or a good enemy to essentially help a leader bring people together who are feeling afraid and say, look, I know why you're afraid, because we're facing both these internal enemies, the enemy at home and the enemy abroad. And so a lot of this book is also, I think, for your viewers, would be interested in how all these factors are shaping the way people think about our foreign policy, the militarism and of both the domestic policing of America, which has been much in the news lately, and the war in Iran and the Middle East and so forth, possible problems which are very interrelated with that, with China and with Taiwan, all of which is to say that these underlying social and economic conditions at home are giving rise both to a politics which is really scary at home in terms of authoritarianism, and also to a foreign policy that helps give some context to some of the emerging flashpoints of war and militarism abroad. Yeah.
So is it the domestic situation that is driving the foreign policy, or is it the foreign policy that has created the domestic situation? Because for me, I look back at U.S. history, and it's really always been an oligarchy, and it's always been an oligarchy of private wealth, which does separate it from the Europeans, meaning that the only real creed of Americans that you could say applies across space and time is making money. We're supposedly a Christian nation, but if you've read the Sermon on the Mount, the Christianity is the most antithetical thing to America to actually existing America, United States of America. And then this foreign policy of expansion was that was, whether you call it foreign or domestic, up to manifest destiny, is a brutal genocidal process, but it was kept off of most people's immediate under awareness. Like, it was because it was out on the frontier, and we didn't have TikTok, we didn't have the U.S. Army posting videos of them burning down villages, and driving American Indians off their land. But we were always doing these things. There's one little moment, the New Deal era, where we weren't really that intensely engaged in imperialism. You have the good neighbor policy and so on. But then even at that point, in 1939, the Wall Street Council on Foreign Relations meets with the State Department of Franklin Roosevelt, and they have this War and Peace Studies project, which determines that the U.S. should go for global hegemony over the capitalist system after the war. And that they were just going to basically, this gets publicized as the American Century by Henry Luce. And he says, freedom will need more Lebensraum than tyranny, except he says living space, but it was obviously a reference to this. So, and then the U.S., after World War II in the 50s, which is supposedly this golden age, but really we're committing all sorts of crimes and doing gangster business around the world and lying about it. We create the CIA so we can murder people and overthrow governments, democratic governments even, and then say we didn't do it. I mean, this seems to be in my estimation. This is what's driven the rise of this oligarchy that's tied to empire, and the sort of brutality that we've imposed on the rest of the world to the extent that we could. Now, because of, I think, kind of desperation, because this empire is ending as others are, it's coming home. So, I mean, Malcolm X was saying, yeah, the Kennedy assassination is like the chickens are coming home to roost. And he explained what he meant. He said, we send all these people out to, it's like when you send your chickens out on a farm, they always come back to roost. And the people we sent to kill people all around the world, now they're coming back here. And this is what we're dealing with. Or C. Wright Mills wrote in 1956 of Power Elite, which says, this isn't any democracy. This is an oligarchy of interchangeable leaders in the political, business, and military realms. And it's really a top-down thing. And the great mass of population is essentially politically neutralized. So
Yeah,
there's decades and decades and decades that have been building to this, if you look at it in those terms.
I agree with everything you just said. The book, and most of my writing, is very historical, and you've outlined very well. We are a history of oligarchy. We've had oligarchies from the beginning of the country, and the oligarchies, it's hard to separate. You said which is causing which. They're so intertwined. So the oligarchy has domestic interests, which is accumulating wealth in the oligarchy itself and keeping the rest of the country poor. And to do that, to expand its wealth, it also needs to secure markets and resources and cheap labor abroad. So you're right. This whole dynamic is absolutely deep in the bloodstream of American history. So Trumpism and the authoritarianism and the militarism that I'm talking about in the book are absolutely not new in America. In fact, one of my critiques of the anti-Trump resistance is that it tends to say, well, if we can I'm worried that many people in the resistance are seeing all our problems as just Trump and the current dynamic, and sort of saying, if we can just go back to what things were like before Trump, normalizing the pre-Trump era. And my view is very similar to yours, that these problems have been, the reason Trump has taken hold and the reason why he's more dangerous is that the conditions that gave rise to the current, both the domestic authoritarianism and the foreign policy, have been with us since the beginning of the country. I did another book a year ago called Who Owns Democracy, which goes back to the founders and traces the whole history. And I'm doing a couple of new books that go into this more depth as well. But the thing I would say is that the sort of socioside, the shift from the sort of more sociopathic tendencies to the sociocidal ones came when the oligarchy sort of discovered neoliberalism in the 80s and 90s and went at it in the conditions that were allowed it. This was not new. Neoliberalism, I think I see neoliberalism, which was basically the argument that both the Republicans and Democrats embraced, which was markets were everything. That meant globally that America was at the stage where it needed and deserved unrestrained access to foreign resources and markets. Communication patterns and shifts of capital along with the internet were making more possible this military and economic expansion abroad. So I see the neoliberal shift in the late 80s and 90s as not something fundamentally new. I agree with you that these oligarchic forces that I'm sort of translating into both extreme economic insecurity and social insecurity have always been with America. They distinguish America from any other developed country. So we've always been, damaged as a society, and in terms of our action in the world, damaging other people this way. But I think that, it's just being intensified under Trump. And the thing about, we've always had an authoritarian kind of, a very shallow democracy, a very long, the robber barons in the 1890s, was that a democratic society when you had 90% of the country were poor, working in, and John Rockefeller became the first billionaire. J.P. Morgan was bailing out the United States. We've always had this oligarchy, and this oligarchy is at the heart of this crisis. As long as we have this oligarchy, which we've had forever, we're going to have it. Trump is sort of layering on a level of centralized, executive power, which has implications for both the domestic militarism and the foreign militarism of the country. Is Trump really going to do something fundamentally different from I talk a lot in the book about the resemblance of Trump's foreign policy to Andrew Jackson's, to Teddy Roosevelt's, you're right, the only period where the oligarchy, both in its domestic and foreign policy, Aaron, in my view, was sort of temporarily halted and not taken away, was the New Deal. And that reflected, when Roosevelt came in, the country was in such dire economic straits, there was an opportunity to break a bit with this hold that the oligarchies, and by oligarchies, again, I simply mean the economic elites who were controlling much of the capital of the country and much of the politics of the country, because control of capital and control of money and control of politics is always very closely related. And the domestic implications of it are always very closely tied to foreign policy. But I simply think that what I argue in this book is that when the resistance is building against Trump, it has to keep in mind that we're dealing with a national pathology that goes deep into our history. If we go back to pre-Trump, we'll simply get another Trump. We'll get more domestic militarism and more foreign militarism. You've got to deal with the resistance has to take seriously the control of economic elites and of the oligarchies, which have become much more intense. We have 800 billionaires who control more wealth than about 90% of the population. The stock market right now is at an all-time peak, but a very small number of people, 3 Americans, have more money in the markets than 50% of Americans. We've never had this scale of inequality. And I think, the war in Iran, in terms of going back to the militarism question, American global hegemony is in a challenging moment, and when empires are being challenged, so the rise of China, the fate of, Taiwan is very closely related to what's going on in the Middle East, I think, and to Trump's and bombing of Iran. In my view, this is the Middle Eastern struggle is all connected with this stuff. Militarism has always been part of an empire that is in deeper trouble. America, after, like as you were saying, after World War II, it kind of had a lock on power around the world. European competitors were not allowed to be militarized, and Russia and China were weak. So you had this period where
just it. Russia and China lost 50 million people in World War II. And then after World War II, the richest, most powerful country by far in the world says, these people in Russia and China are so threatening. They're a global communist conspiracy, and we basically have to reorganize all of society to defeat these powerful people who were basically basket cases. They lost so much in that war. We never really wanted to go with. There was a lot of opposition to going to war with the Nazis. We wanted to go after Russia. That was just not because Russia was so powerful, but because Russia was seen as sort of representing an ideology that could be exploited more fully. If the American religion and the only creed we really have is money, aka property, and then you have a political force that says we will abolish property, of course they're going to be the enemy of the oligarchy. They are their antithesis.
Absolutely. And the same is happening with, so the new thing that I think is worrisome, obviously, is that the level of authoritarianism has intensified. And so we have, for example, Hitler went after the Slavs, the Jews, the Gypsies. You have authoritarians always have domestic enemies that are
They went after the leftists first.
And well, absolutely.
And Hitler, they called themselves the Anti-Comintern Pact.
Yes.
So there's no getting around the fact that they were ultimately a defense of capital.
Yes, and you know, America First, the term Trump uses for himself, emerged, that phrase emerged in that, as you know, during that period with the rise of the America First movement in the United States, which had millions of people, and it was funded by very wealthy people like Henry Ford, who was an overt fascist. And these guys, even people like George Kennan, who were seen as sort of liberal State Department, they really thought that America could get along with Germany. They wanted to go after Russia. The American military, many people, when they got into Berlin, they wanted to go right to Moscow. They weren't really interested in Germany per se. But in any case, I think what I want to argue is that when you asked, is this, you know, which is driving which, I see what, you know, is it, I think these things are so deeply intertwined, as you pointed out, and they're so deeply historical.
Yeah, it's imperial capitalism. The U.S. has always been an imperial capitalist enterprise.
But what I try to argue in the book is that the level of, and it's only one element of it, but the level of both economic inequality is unprecedented. We've always had a huge economic inequality. I go through the robber baron era of the Gilded Age and of the 1980s. If you look at the data on the level of economic concentration of capital, level of monopoly capital, it's just unprecedented. At the same time, if you look at all the data that I show in the book about the breakdown of social capital, especially in the working classes, it's incredibly intense. And I think there's something, speaking now as a sociologist, there's something about the kind of anxiety and fear that comes as people lose a sense that somebody cares about them. Somebody is aware that they exist, that if something goes wrong, they'll be protected in some way. That's always been an issue in America because of our resistance to the idea of anything but, you know, the market and, as we say, except in the New Deal, some sense of collectivity. But I think it's been intensified, and it has that sort of breakdown of social capital has many effects and manifestations. For example, climate change issues, which are now growing intense, are going to be, they are intensifying sociocide and reflecting it, so that, you know, it's looking more and more like I've seen projections that up to a third of American housing will not be able to get insurance because of changing weather conditions and so forth. That adds to the insecurity and fear of people. Remember, fascism and authoritarianism always grow out of a sense of fear and the breakdown of social,
especially the fear of the oligarchs. I mean, I feel like this is what of course, the average people are feeling great insecurity and fear about what comes next for good reason, because they're living in a state of imperial decline, an empire in terminal decline. And capitalism, in, you know, modern Western capitalism, has never given up its hegemony over society. And if its hegemony over society is threatened, then you get fascism. That has been the case, and that seems to be more of what we're seeing. And people like Peter Thiel and Alex Karp, you know, the guys that run Palantir, it's pretty obvious what they are doing. They want to create a massive surveillance state because they know they need it, because they know that this oligarchy cannot but be extremely unpopular as people are more and more poor and desperate, and as the empire is falling apart. So these are kind of predictable things.
Right. Absolutely. And I think what you said is exactly true. I think that, I mean, I actually take some reassurance from the fact that, you know, the way authoritarian, once you have these underlying economic conditions and the social conditions associated with them, so sort of extreme oligarchy and inequality and extreme sociocide, people are going to be afraid. They're going to be angry, and they're going to need somebody to blame. And these give conditions for classic far-right populism in America and classic fascism. And I think that one thing I've taken a little reassurance from is that the people who are getting hit hardest right now, being blamed most. It's wonderful to have people. That's why fascism always creates, often racialized nationalist enemies, because you need somebody to blame other than the oligarchs. And people don't like the oligarchs. You're right about that. And Trump's current economic policies are extremely unpopular. So how do you maintain power? You say, well, the people that are really, really causing you the problem are these other people who are not real Americans, who are not real. So that starts with immigrants. And I'm taking a little bit of reassurance. The way Hitler survived was he made ordinary Germans, even many Jews who weren't put into camps, safe by essentially saying, look, all your problems are due to these domestic enemies. And he had some foreign enemies that he would build on, which, that's what fascism grows on, the sense of blaming an enemy who explains people's, fear and extreme economic, social problems. So in America, Trump is really good at blaming internal enemies, and he's focusing on immigrants, but also gays, women, a whole bunch of internal enemy. I take some reassurance, Aaron, from the fact that I didn't know whether ordinary Americans would just sort of like Germans did with the people targeted in fascist Germany. I thought many of them might simply say, well, the immigrants are a problem. They're criminal, they're so forth. Let's get rid of them. And they would support a massive purge and sort of a war against immigrants, which Trump has been waging. They're not supporting it. It's sort of reassuring to me that there's evidence in the polls and the way Americans are responding that his attacks on immigrants are brutal enough that he's not picking up great support from ordinary people about these issues. And his economic policies are becoming less and less popular. So I think that it's a sign that despite the kind of grim realities of economic oligarchy and of social disintegration, this sort of breakdown of empathy in society. I see these signs in the protests, which I kind of like, which they holding signs saying radical empathy. And what they mean is, don't be an ick. I remember we started talking about the ick, the IK in Uganda. Well, Americans are not totally ickicized, so to speak. They're not totally saying, fuck you to everybody who's not just like me. They're showing some degree of concern for other people.
Especially, look, the younger people in Glastonbury, the music festival, you had a person who was speaking up for the Palestinians, and the crowd began chanting things like "Death to the IDF," right. Which is, people said, "Oh, you're saying kill all the Jews," but "Death to the IDF" is pretty much analogous to "Death to the Wehrmacht."
Right.
And and now, instead of somebody being critical of Israel and it destroying their career, this guy is now hugely popular. So there are signs that people, and Kamala Harris, the more data that comes back, it's pretty clear that one of the biggest, if not the biggest reasons that she lost is that she wouldn't oppose genocide in Gaza. And this is this marks a kind of sea change.
Yes.
Domestically, in terms of the sensibilities of even the people in the West, but around the world also, there's just this sense that this regime of the West, the Western imperialism, white power, white supremacy, it has no legitimacy anymore. What's happening in Palestine, the fact that we just installed ISIS to run Syria, which was a 10-year project, and all of these liberals and leftists who are like, no, you have to understand the legitimate grievances of the Syrian liberal democratic protesters. Don't be a campist. Like, all of these stupid, tired arguments of these dinosaurs are basically refuted. We installed ISIS in Syria, which makes ISIS essentially our sock puppet, which is something only people like me were saying for, since the whole thing began. But now it's true. Yeah. I feel like they cannot deal with the propping up and polishing the bullshit that they tell us is reality anymore. And it's like we're just waiting for it's like they're the sort of Wile E. Coyote having run off the cliff at this point, and the world is just watching, waiting for it to collapse. That
Well,
to me
yes,
seems like the central
yes.
driver of what's going to happen. Or are we just going to blow up the world?
Yes and no. The along with my optimism about ordinary Americans responding to a lot of the brutality that we're seeing at home, the problem, I think, in terms of foreign policy is, and more generally, is the Democratic Party. I mean, you need an opposition beyond. I mean, the most important opposition is on the streets and in mass, resistance that perseveres. But we also need a viable opposition politically in terms of the political parties. And you mentioned Kamala Harris. I think we can't not avoid in this conversation the centrality, both in the rise of sociocide, the rise of the oligarchy, the sort of consolidation of the oligarchy, and most of all of militarism in the United States, is that it's so fundamentally bipartisan. I mean, the Democratic Party, the one thing that happened that allowed the New Deal to create a break in oligarchic America was you had enough of a sort of shift in the Democratic Party that you had a possibility of beginning to challenge, the most bipartisan oligarchic and, foreign policy premises that have always run America. And today, the crisis we're in, the Democrats handed the country over to Trump because they simply ran on a totally militaristic, bipartisan kind of oligarchic agenda. They, since Bill Clinton, when Reagan, introduced neoliberalism, Clinton in his 1992, inaugural said, the Democratic Party is no longer the party of government. It's no longer the party of workers. It's the party of identity. We're moving into identity politics, which was essentially an abandonment of any kind of critique of class oligarchic politics, anti-oligarchic politics at home. Clinton was unifying the oligarchy. And he was also making clear that America would be the globalizing, imperialistic partner of the oligarchy. So, since the late 90s, the Democratic Party has, totally abandoned that one, as you said, the one sort of small historical area, which, as you said, only lasted in the very first years of the New Deal before the New Deal itself went in a more militaristic direction with Truman and so forth. But that has been incredibly important in the whole dynamic we talked about, because the biggest political earthquake in American politics over the last 50, 70 years has been the flight of ordinary American working people from the Democratic Party into the Republican Party. And that has...
Or it's not voting, period.
Or not voting. But it's they've fled, for very understandable reason, the Democratic Party, which became a party over the last 30, 40 years, totally aligned, obviously, with militarism, being, it's now in many ways the most militarized party. And its policies in the Middle East made that so clear under Biden and Harris and so forth. And its broader foreign policy Biden symbolized he was the foreign policy guy for the Democrats for years and years and years, never raising his voice against American militarism. So the Democratic Party was locked into that. And that wasn't surprising, because domestically they were aligned and funded by their own class of, very wealthy, now billionaire donors who had their own interests in this oligarchic kind of America, which, after all, as we've talked about all hour here, goes all the way back in American history. There's nothing new really under the sun here. And so I think, I pay a lot of attention in the book to what happened to the Democratic Party and how much I have a chapter saying how the Democratic Party handed America over to Trump. And it has to do, I've long had this critique of identity politics. It's not because I don't take race or gender seriously. It's that, the kind of, I call it a siloed identity politics, the kind of identity politics that the Democrats have run is the idea that, well, every group has its own kind of problem, and they have to fight for their own thing. And it doesn't sort of bring them together to oppose the system that they're all laboring under. In fact, it
Isn't
leads
that
them.
by design, though? I mean, don't you think
Oh,
that
absolutely.
James Madison wrote a long time ago that, like, because there was a question of, well, if we let more people vote, wouldn't they vote to, like, essentially get rid of the oligarchy and vote to increase their own interests? And he said, no, there will always be factionalism,
Right.
And that we can always manipulate that way. So we don't have to fear democracy such as it is because of that. And now we have this, I mean, look at how the foundations and departments and universities promote all of this culture war sort of ideology, like these, as if these are really important issues. We live under a lawless imperial capitalist regime that serves an oligarchy and really negates democracy. So if you don't really have any meaningful democracy in any real sense, then that's really the only political issue. That you live under a despotic, lawless, imperial capitalist regime. That is the only issue. But if other people are thinking like, no, the issue is really, this particular culture war thing, then you're never going to have solidarity. The only solution is solidarity, and this precludes solidarity. That's why I think that the foundations and everybody supports all of this and turns us into a bunch of identity-obsessed narcissists.
Yeah. Well, I've written a lot of books on the culture of this, the sort of hyper-individualistic and so forth, but it's absolutely true that these patterns go deep, deep into the history. That's why, again, I worry most. I love the anti-Trump resistance, but I worry about its normalization of pre-Trump. There's so much of the Trump resistance that says, if only we can get rid of Trump, let's go back to, Obama or something like that. That's not the period you want to go back to, because, I mean, the racial income gap grew substantially under Obama. He
was a total disaster.
Yeah. And you go all the way back, in a new book I'm working on, if you look at the Constitution itself, which tends to be idealized, it was really the Constitution, it was based on when the founders were meeting to write the Constitution. And I'm bringing this up just because it shows sort of what you've been talking about. The historical foundations go way, way back. The founders were very immersed in British political theory and went back to the Magna Carta and the idea. They studied it intensely, and they saw the Constitution as sort of like limiting the power of the monarchy, sort of Magna Carta spirit. Well, if you study the Magna Carta was a very oligarchic document. Magna Carta.
Right. It was due process for the aristocracy.
Right. It was actually called in 1215 the Article of the Barons. And the barons they meant, we could sort of think of our robber barons, which is an apt metaphor. The barons at the time were counts and, dukes and others who were not kings, who were being taxed by the king for his adventures in France and didn't like that. So the Magna Carta was sold as a revolt against the monarchy. And the American Constitution was sold the same way. There were two problems with that. The Magna Carta itself never had a democratic vision. The idea that ordinary serfs in the Middle Ages would have ordinary people, human rights, was never even entertained. It was obvious that the nobility were a caste unto themselves. And, this was embraced by the American barons. The Rockefeller and Morgan, they built these Newport palaces, which were deliberately modeled after the British aristocracy. If you go to Newport, which probably some of your listeners do, you see this overt emulation of the British, aristocracy, which is how the barons in America saw themselves. And this goes back to the very beginning of the country. When America, it was not a revolt against the king. The country that was running, the people running Britain at the time was Parliament and the rising British oligarchy and the companies.
Ben Franklin said that explicitly. He said all of these navigation acts and these other things are these acts of Parliament that have brought us to this moment.
The Britain was a parliamentary system far before America. And America, just the revolution in many ways just shifted the oligarchy over from the British oligarchy. I mean, in a way, we moved toward a less democratic system in the revolution, because under the British Parliament, you really did have limitations on. You had some sort of legal order that when the American Constitution came into play, despite all the legal rights and so forth built into the human rights and so forth, as you point out, if you listen to what the Madison and Jefferson and what they were saying, they were using Magna Carta discourse and really making clear that they wanted to limit the presidency only insofar as it could be clear that the resources of the country, both the domestic and foreign policy of the country, would be driven by an aristocracy that was broader than the king himself, although he was usually going to be part of that aristocracy. And this takes us back, as you said, this is part of a long, C. Wright Mills and a large number of sociologists and social theorists and Marxist theorists, but also non-Marxist, people like William Domhoff, who wrote Who Rules America. This notion that America from the very earliest stages was really constitutionally shaped, like in the Magna Carta. There's a picture of the Magna Carta scroll as the founders as they're writing the Constitution. And that has become an image of democratic rights. It's quite the opposite. I mean, the Magna Carta, if you really look at it historically, is a symbol of oligarchic rule. And as a state, there was never in the Magna Carta for centuries.
It marks a transition from, autocratic rule to oligarchic rule.
Yeah, well, even that was somewhat,
celebrate that.
Even that was somewhat limited. I mean, the kings ignored it for a long time. The rule in the Magna Carta itself, there were 680 provisions, and 2 of them had to do with putting limits on the king. So, and this is what's characteristic of the American Constitution as well. The limits on the power of the presidency are real, but they're extremely ambiguous. There's for just one example, which is really important in the Trump regime, is that the powers of emergency, declaration of emergency, which became very evident after 9/11, it became extreme, the Patriot Act and the
we don't even know what they've done. There are continuity of government provisions that from a state of emergency that Congress renews every year we're not allowed to even know what they are, because one Congressman, Peter DeFazio, tried to find out, and he was told, you can't know that. Even though Congress is supposed to review the state of emergency every year, they don't. So we don't even know what powers have been assumed since 9/11.
I mean, the constitutional rules about habeas corpus and when they can be suspended, there is a suspension clause in the Constitution which indicates when habeas corpus rights, which are the fundamental rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights in the 14th Amendment, those are also subject to a lot of sort of discretionary decision-making by the president. And so, although this is not to discount some of my argument is that the history of democracy, and I've been writing several books about this, there is an element of what I call shallow democracy. There's enough of a veneer of democracy that it enables an oligarchy to gain legitimacy. There are certain meaningful civil liberties, and the fact that you and I can have this conversation without being shot or being likely targeted right away or something like that is a sign that we're not in a kind of fascist state which will simply eliminate any dissent over at all. But
we're not in an overtly fascist state.
Yes, I talk about the different kinds of wiring of authoritarian states, and they're more kind of masked and unmasked. I call it covert and overt kinds of authoritarian oligarchic wiring. And so historically, it's been somewhat more covert. It's become more overt, where the oligarchy comes directly into positions of power in the government. And whether you have Musk as a co-president for a while, or you have 11 billionaires worth, several $1 trillion in Trump's cabinet, it's a little bit more overt. But there's still this kind of veneer, which is not completely gone, which gives people a sense that things are okay. And it sort of accelerates this idea of just return to normalcy in America. We go back before Trump and we have real democracy. No, you go back before Trump and you will get a form of Trump again, because the whole order of American economically is structured around this kind of Magna Carta aristocracy model. And so, however, to say this, I mean, I think people can hear this and say, these guys just don't believe there's any possibility of change.
Yeah, let's hear what you think are the possibilities, because I'm not so pessimistic either, but probably for different reasons than you. So what do you think is the solution to this?
As I said, the resistance is real. I mean, we're getting a very, the people who study resistance around the world right now to authoritarian regimes, have made this argument about the 3.5%. Whether you get 3.5% of the population out on the streets over a sustained period of time, you have very good prospects for success. And we have that. I mean, the combination of we're getting very large numbers of people persevering out on the streets. That's not enough, really, but it's a good beginning. As I said before, the fact that ordinary Americans in red states, even working class people, non-college people, have been, rallying out when their friends who are immigrants or undocumented in a dining, in a sort of Home Depot or a cafe that they eat in, they are pissed off, and I would not have known that. And that gives me a sense of hope that despite the sociocidal forces in America, that people do have a sense of caring, that people do there's been a much stronger reaction against this war on immigrants, which I don't know if you saw, this is now being expanded from immigrants to naturalized citizens. So they've just announced that
they're giving all these exemptions to the major people that are employing them anyway. Like as far as I understand it, construction and other places like Trump.
Yeah, they're not going into hotels right now, but
hotels. That's another one. Yeah,
but there's still. I mean, it's not like this is going away. This is going to be. But the optimism. I mean, the sense of hope I have is, one, you've got these 3.5% threshold. You've got the other thing that in order to succeed, you have to do is have increasingly, you can't just have people out in the street and disappear. That was happening in a way like in George Floyd or the Black Lives Matter protest. You need, out of these mass protests, you need institutionalized sort of new formations, whether it's in labor and the rise of, I was very encouraged by the fact that, under Sean Fain, the UAW, for the first time, really represented in the opposition in the Gaza and so forth. It represented a watershed for American labor during the New Deal was and onward was always Cold War labor. It was always supportive of a kind
of. The biggest union was the Teamsters, and they were kind of an adjunct to the National Crime Syndicate.
Yeah.
So that whole history is murky. We don't even fully understand it, but
But I want to stay with the optimism here. That the fact that you have now a growing number of labor people challenging American foreign policy is itself one to.
Oh, especially the Israel thing, because that was just it. Hoffa took all these trips to Israel, and he helped them in 1948. Along with Meyer Lansky, his
so the
partner
UAW,
there. This is a sordid history of labor.
The UAW is now organizing on campus, and it's challenging American foreign policy in Israel and the Middle East. And there's also a deeper change in labor. I mean, last year we had the largest number of strikes since 1963. And more important, maybe, is that there's an emerging force in American labor which is moving from traditional collective bargaining which is just bargaining for greater wages and better working conditions in your own, shop or your own local. That's important. But you've got more labor people who are recognizing these broader systemic issues about the oligarchy and war that we've been talking about, that are now building, elements of a labor movement that are saying, we need a general strike. Sean Fain has called for a general strike in 2028 that he's organizing for. They're calling for a sort of labor moving beyond the classic sort of agenda of collective bargaining, which will remain, but for a broader notion of economic democracy and of worker participation, which might look a little bit more like social democratic labor in Europe. And that's combined with a big question about the thing we were talking about before is whether the Democratic Party is going to move to become a genuinely democratic party. And in Europe, after fascism, the Europeans had an advantage. They were not allowed to remilitarize after World War II. So they were able to essentially rebuild their domestic economies without this incredible suck of war. America sort of provided the military money for that. And so, they
didn't need to. There really wasn't any threat to Europe.
Yeah, but they could easily, as they are today, they could have remilitarized, but they weren't allowed to. It was built to the conditions that the Allies put on them. So you had the rise of a social democratic party after all that fascism. And this is important because Americans have to ask, what comes after Trump and what is it the resistance should be fighting for? So beyond being out in the streets in large numbers and persevering and tying to labor, which is central to to unions and community groups that are challenging the oligarchy, the future of the Democratic Party or other parties that might emerge. I mean, the New York mayoral thing is going to be an interesting development where you have a kind of guy who calls himself democratic socialist, who has a very different foreign policy and who is arguing, he's got a lot of people are in the Democratic Party are noticing him, and it's triggering a war. You notice that people like Kristen Gillibrand, two other Democratic leaders have come out against him. But I think that he reflects, if you look at the polls, he reflects the anti-war sentiment and the anti-oligarchic sentiments are always intertwined, that the Democratic Party has to take seriously. So I think... But
how can they? How can the Democrats? I mean, the heart of it is the neoconservatism and Zionism have really dictated a large part of U.S. foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. That's become more clear to me over time. I previously thought that the Iraq war was as much about oil as Israel, but now I don't. Having spoken to people who work in oil and that were a part of that, I don't really think that was the case. And it's all laid out in the 1996 report by Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl. I think the Clean Break report is commissioned by Bibi Netanyahu, and it just points out everything that we've been going through, attacking Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. It's been what they've been doing, and it's falling apart because it's insane. That to me is the interesting thing. Is we are failing.
The optimism, Aaron. The American people. Trump ran as an anti-war thing. It was nonsense because Trump in his first term had been, he bombed Syria, he bombed Iran. He
assassinated Soleimani.
Yeah, I mean, he never was anti-war, but people voted for him because they thought he was anti-war. And you've got these MAGA people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson coming out saying Trump's making the wrong decision on the war and so forth. So this reflects the fact, I'm sure you've seen these numbers, that the American public right now is more anti-war. When you ask people, do you support the bombing of Iran? Do you support another forever war in the Middle East? Overwhelmingly reject it.
Yeah, and Trump knows it. Trump knows it. That's part of, I think, why he's saying we destroyed their nuclear facilities, and Iran is saying, they damaged them pretty bad. But the Washington Post, the CIA's favorite, newspaper, is saying that they didn't destroy them enough.
Right.
Where it's like, wow, I actually think I think Trump on some level or people around him, this is possible, but it's possible they could do anything. He's very beholden to Adelson and the Israel lobby, but the fact that Trump is saying that is exaggerating the success, which means no need for a further attack, is itself points to something positive, perhaps, depending on how things play out, or it'll seem like another farce.
Oh, it is important.
Down the road.
It is very important. I don't think it'll hold, but it is a sign that Trump understands. The one thing the guy is fairly good at is reading a few political tea leaves, and he knows that if he comes to be perceived as a war president, leading the country into another, Middle Eastern war, it's not going to be good for him politically. So on the positive side, I think when you said, well, what's going to keep this going, and given the difficulties of bringing the Democratic Party out of this oligarchic, warlike, kind of script they've been running, since the end of the New Deal, and even during parts of the New Deal, I think you've just got to count on the organizational capacity of the resistance in the streets to build over time connections to labor. I'm very encouraged by the fact that labor is now developing campus ties. So you're getting this unusual sort of coalition of young people with labor. Young people knew nothing about labor, and young people are under a lot of pressure for jobs. I see it on campuses all the time. The tuitions, the universities have been corporatized for many, many years, and so that's had the effect. Meaning, universities are part of the oligarchy in many ways. They're increasingly integrated with,
of course,
and that has an effect on tuitions. And kids tell me they feel like, as students, they feel like they're returns on their parents' investment, and therefore they have to just go to Wall Street and make a lot of money. But at the same time, it's getting harder to get those jobs. I think we're likely, given the economic effects of tariffs and of the bond crisis and the dollar weakness and so forth, we're going to see we'll see what happens after July when these new tariff, it looks like he's going toward a 25% baseline tariff. That's going to, the markets are insanely high right now, and maintaining an illusory idea, I think, of kind of long-term good economic times. Wall Street is actually predicting recession, maybe, as you know, maybe more serious bond, not just the stock market, but the bond markets and the dollar itself. Because what's happening is that as countries are understanding what Trump is trying to do, they're realizing that the supply chains, they've got to reroute their supply chains around America. You look at what he's saying about Canada right now. And I think a lot of the Middle Eastern stuff around Iran has to do with, if you can get rid of Iran, they're fearful that China will be able to route much of its Belt and Belt initiative through Iranian backing. And if you can take apart Iran, you can undermine some of the capability of China to expand that, because China is sort of the main competitor to the global hegemonic position that they're going to
defeat it. They're going to. This is where I see the optimism, which derives from the grim assessment that I have. Empires fall inevitably, and the pressure that the U.S. is trying to put on the rest of the world as it scrambles around trying to maintain its position, everything it's doing is eroding it. I mean, I think that the reason that we see Israel going for the final solution in Gaza is because there is a sense that with U.S. hegemony waning, they have a window of opportunity to do what they want to do, which is what they've been working for. I would say, honestly, that when you look back at the early Zionists like Ben Gurion and so on, they were always like this. They killed Femke Bernadotte who was a UN official, a Swedish diplomat back in the 40s, just because they thought he was too friendly to the Palestinians' side, so they just murdered him. I mean, that's always been there. You look back at them, they're essentially fascists. And the other things seem to be more like analogous to the U.S. having a veneer of democracy. There was this veneer of socialism and liberalism and Zionism, but I think really the commanding heights were always essentially fascistic. But everything they're doing is just creating more opposition to them. And the same goes for the U.S. So economically, these tariffs are not helping the U.S., but what it is doing is feeding dialectically the nemesis to this, which is, I believe, the global South, led by China, and with Russia and Iran as also crucial partners, and that the West cannot defeat them, and that they're headed for one huge defeat in Ukraine, which has been the most ridiculous situation ever, because what we've done to Ukraine is so terrible. If the U.S. overthrew that government, put in a puppet, and specifically to mess with Russia and harm Russia's security. And it's blown up in our faces, and we couldn't change that policy. It may well destroy NATO, which has no reason to exist anymore. Russia has no designs on invading Germany. It's preposterous. So the U.S. is in such bad shape, and its hegemony economically, militarily, culturally, I think we're seen as depraved sickos who will drop bombs on babies, by the thousands, because that's what we are. And so I feel like this loss of legitimacy is so irreversible, and that is what is going to do it. We are politically neutralized, I think, but the situation of the U.S. and the world is going to change the structural conditions. And then there will be windows for opportunity because it can't continue like this.
Yeah. Well, my only reaction as I hear you say that is that I think about what happened to Germany after World War I. World War I, Germany was destroyed. It was subject to huge retaliatory sanctions by Britain and the United States. And
unpayable debts.
Yeah, unpayable debts. It created, basically German, a fairly advanced German sort of social welfare state, started with Bismarck, had been undermined. And after World War I, that had all collapsed. It was sort of like you could say what you just described as the current situation in America. There was a bit of a German empire. That was all eroded after World War I. And it created hyperinflation, even before the markets crashed.
This is the U.S.'s fault, really. They demanded that Britain and France pay them back, and the Britain and France had no choice but to try to get the money from Germany, and so the U.S. loaned money to Germany.
Right. The Morgan interests had all loaned a lot of money to Britain, and they wanted to get paid back, and so the sanctions were put heavily on Germany. I just want to respond to your optimism. I don't share fully the optimism that the collapse. Right now, what happened in Germany was that it was a combination of humiliation from defeat in war combined with economic crisis, and that proved a perfect formula for the rise of fascism in Germany. So you could take your argument that the rise, that the sort of collapse of American empire and the breakdown of American economic well-being for most people in the oligarchy. You're saying, well, that could be the force that actually makes us free and freer of the past. Possibly, but the history is not particularly reassuring about that. It's also a recipe for intense fascism and authoritarianism.
Well, that we are seeing now. I agree that we are seeing that now.
So I think my view is that if you're envisaging, further, and I think we should be, that American economic and military power is going to be continuously challenged abroad, and it's going to be domestically more precarious and so forth. What you've got to have in place is preparation for that. You need to have people, I think like the Keith optimism is right now. We'll see on, this coming weekend, there's supposed to be another huge set of demonstrations. The No Kings thing was arguably the biggest day of American protest in American history. It was over that 3.5% threshold that, the movement strategists like to think about. I think the key thing for me is whether you're going to see, the key thing for a successful resistance is perseverance and sort of building. For example, in the Arab Spring, you had a lot of young Arab people coming out on the street in 2011 in Egypt, but they never were able to sort of connect with each other through organizational like unions or even religious groups that sort of coalesced, and they collapsed. In Tunisia and Morocco, you had an ongoing labor formation that could coalesce with people out in the streets, and the same thing happened in Poland with Solidarity, which allowed a resistance to develop in a more effective way. So to my mind, the prospects of something good coming out of all this disaster that's happening is that you need to have, like I said, I'm very encouraged by the fact that Americans are not liking what Trump is doing. His numbers are really low, and particularly his attack on immigrants, such an easy target, criminal immigrants, but that's not going over well. It's not sitting well with the American people. So the American people, despite all the sociocidal forces I've been talking about, have the capability of saying, there's these signs, radical empathy. That's a sign of saying, hey, this could happen. We don't like this happening to you. And we realize it could happen to us. And Christianity and anything we believe in among very traditional Americans are saying, this is not who we are. So I think if that spirit, the key to that question as to where this goes is perseverance. Do you have, out of the continuing resistance? Do you have, for example, labor unions, Democratic Party, local city governments, states, attorney generals, and so forth, who coalesce in a real, the key to it in my mind is perseverance. Do people stay with and build the organizational capacity to resist in the long term? And that we don't know. I mean, that's the goal. That's the hope, in my judgment, that you have large numbers of people pissed off, large number of people hurting, large people seeing that the Democratic Party or some party saying we can't have more of the status quo. You know, she ran, you know, Kamala Harris ran as a status quo Democrat, running on the script of the Democratic Party over the last, the post-New Deal Democratic Party. That cannot survive. You know, this guy running for mayor of New York, Mamdani, I mean, the Democratic Party has to get behind some version of this. The fact that Bernie and, AOC got, tens and hundreds of thousands of people out to these fighting oligarchy tours is an important thing, because they were mostly in red states. I mean, a lot of Democrats came out to those protests, but a lot of Republicans did too. And it's, as I said, the polls are showing that Republicans do not like war, and they don't want money put into war, and they don't like the oligarchy. It's very, very powerful. If you look at data right now about what people, ordinary Americans, including Republicans, are thinking about billionaires and big companies, the Peter Thiels of the world and the Palantirs, it's very low. The anti-corporate polling is higher than it's been since the New Deal. It's really, really high. The pro-labor and I'll just say the pro-union, pro-labor polling is higher than it's been in 50 or 60 years. And this is true among Republicans, among people who voted for Trump. And so there is a kind of foundation in the population for an enduring, persevering kind of resistance and the building of a more social democratic movement and politics. And that, to me, is the hope. It's not at all guaranteed, because the corporate, people who have been running the Democratic Party and the Schumers and the Gillibrands and these people, they've been around forever. So it's not like it's going to be an easy transition. But I think there is if you take somebody like Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut, I never thought of him as a particularly, sort of progressive, but he's coming out very, very strongly for the kind of resistance that I'm talking about, against what the Democratic Party has represented, against the oligarchy in a very, very passionate way. He's walking his state back and forth, sort of like Cory Booker, talking for 25 hours in the Congress. You've got some people, doing civil disobedience, getting arrested, going out, taking risks. That's all sources of hope. So even though the prognosis and the analysis is grim, particularly the reality that we've both been sharing of the historical foundations of how bad these things have been, there is, the veneer is not completely illusory. The veneer has seeded in people a certain set of possibilities or ideas that are the source of possibility in the future. And I think that there's evidence right now from the polling and from the size of the protests and I think that there really is like a possibility that Trump is going to go under, and that your more optimistic scenario of what happens if the empire collapses and the American economy goes sour on workers even further, that this could have positive effects in the long term.
Yes, and that is, I am hoping that these things that you are pointing to, which is growing discontent among the population and an awareness, a real politicization, because I feel like the culture war stuff is essentially depoliticizing us. It's taking us away from politics in the real sense and getting us into cultural issues. And the working class people are not people who are extremely well versed in the postmodern theory that undergirds, the different exotic positions of the cultural vanguard. in the U.S. So I feel like this is a big waste of time, and that we're actually probably being played in a sense by more powerful forces in that way. But the things you point to of a sense of being anti-war, being opposed to corporate power, these are encouraging. And on the one end, on the other end of the spectrum, you have the hold of the oligarchy, the imperial oligarchy, over the global system, the system internationally and domestically, and that those two forces together may lead to reform. I feel it's less likely that the U.S. could really go and try to be a Nazi Germany type of country, because we can't really fight wars and win them anymore. I don't believe that any of our opponents we can defeat easily. If we were to actually destroy Iran, I think the cost would be too high and it would end the American empire. Many analysts think the same thing. And we can't. Well, Taiwan is officially part of China, according to the U.S. Taiwan and China. The fact that we're trying to gin up that as a pretext to attack China is one of the most absurd foreign policy contrivances, really, that I can recall. And that's being an American, where everything we do is an absurd foreign policy contrivance. Russia is kicking our ass in Ukraine, and we have just essentially relegated this country to be destroyed in our attempt to destroy Russia. That's going to have far-reaching consequences. So I feel that these things can come together and perhaps lead to a more positive outcome. We'll see if the Democratic Party can, as a whole, break with Israel, because I feel that they cannot really get the people who care. If you care about social justice at all, you have to be resolutely opposed to the mass slaughter of children, turning a civilian area with no military into Dresden. I mean, is the most absurd criminal thing that it goes beyond anything I've ever seen. I know. The Democratic Party can't break with that. I think they're doomed. So these are all things they can't continue, but they can't change course. That's the position that we're in. That's the position Trump's in. He can't attack Iran. He can't not attack Iran. The Democrats can't break with Israel. They can't keep backing Israel. I think what's going to happen.
That's all fair points, but I think that the political things that I talked about, the currents in the public opinion and the action of it on the street, they do offer some sense of rejoinder to what you're saying. I mean that you can take.
I hope so.
Yeah, and I don't know this, of course, for sure, but in the book I look at responses to these authoritarian and socially atomized kinds of and imperial kinds of, and I do find hope in the history. There is. We've been focusing on the authoritarian history of America, which is very serious and very real. But the resistance history of the country is also real, and it's also impressive in many ways. And so I, as somebody who studies social movements and studies, the ways in which resistance movements, and I write about in this book, Bonfire, and in these new books that I'm merging, I find honest, real sense of possibility. Not in any sense a guarantee, but a real sense that, and I think your point that, if it tries the Nazi approach, I think it is going to run into unaffordable wars and defeats.
Who wants to be drafted now? I feel like there is nobody in the youth, except for schmucks, who would support whatever war would require a draft.
No, the anti-war feeling in the population, like the anti-oligarchic feeling, is amazingly strong, Aaron. I have been just going through this data. I have been really struck. I wasn't expecting it, of how strong the anti-corporate and the pro-worker. And again, it's not really that surprising, because this is not just academic talk or something. It's the real lives that people are experiencing. People are really in a lot. And when you add in to the economic realities, the kind of social insecurity, the feelings of people, when people feel more alone, when they don't feel connected to each other, that takes these economic realities and sort of puts exponential power emotionally to them. Politics runs on, we learned from feminism probably in the second wave feminism of the late 60s, that politics is very personal. So in this book, in the Bonfire book, where I'm focusing on the very personal side of how people are experiencing these more abstract, large macro forces that we're talking about. You mentioned C. Wright Mills, which most people probably don't remember. He was a famous mid-20th century sociologist, wrote a book called The Power Elite, which really laid out the oligarchy and the military and so forth.
It's so true. If you read it today, it's like he's writing about our time.
It's amazing, yeah. And he was prevented from teaching students because of his politics at the time.
The Ford Foundation would not give him a grant to do a follow-up. He was going to do a follow-up called on the cultural apparatus and basically how these power elite forces determine the culture in the society by funding the arts and universities and so on and so forth. Ford Foundation wouldn't give him the grant for it.
Right. But there is, so there is that history, but there is also this history of resistance. And I been surprised that a society subject to so much economic and social brutality and desperation.
Brainwashing.
And brainwashing now with the Silicon Valley adding, that there's so much first of all, political awareness and resistance. Now, I don't want to overstate this. I see students who have ethical concerns about all this stuff we're talking about, the humanitarian crisis you're talking about, genocide. They have it, but they feel locked in. But then there are all kinds of other people I see, and they're out in the streets, who are taking risks or just feel they can't put up with it. And they are increasingly understanding this politically. And so what I try to do in this book is sort of point out there is a personal dimension, an emotional dimension to politics, which is often overlooked. And when you look at social capital and the nature of people's relations to each other, you can't ignore those things. Mills, the core of Mills' argument was not just about the power elite. He said that public issues are always intertwined inseparably with private troubles. Yeah. And what he's saying is that people who study all this stuff we're talking about have got to keep, if they want to be politically relevant, they've got to connect these macro issues with the ways in which people are personally experiencing these forces. How do people experience the oligarchy? It's in their experience and their paycheck and in the nature of their connection with union brothers and sisters, if they have it, or people at work, or being a remote worker. I mean, I was talking to on another podcast, and a guy was talking about, reminding me of when I was in a labor movement, what it was like to go out with the guys and, play softball and have lunch, and how that has sort of disappeared in his experience. And so I think what I've tried to do in this book is take these macro tendencies that you and I tend to agree on and root them in very personal social things that are intimately intertwined. As Mill said, you cannot separate or understand private troubles, anxieties, insecurity from big macro public issues. So in a sense, what I'm doing is a version of Millsian work, with a connection of private troubles and public issues in the current moment when we're dealing with an oligarchy and a sort of imperial and authoritarian, more intense reality, which is translating into the lives and feelings and anxieties of ordinary people of all kinds. And arguing for what kind of politics I see as emerging, some of which has been very reassuring to me, others not so much, but that there really is an opportunity based on when you look at both the personal and the micro personal and the macro social, economic, military side, you can get a reading of that offers hope and will keep you out on the streets.
Charles Derber, where can people buy Bonfire?
It's just come out, so I would, if you just Google me, Charles Derber, and you'll see it in a lot of sites. I think you can get it in bookstores, online, local. It's pretty available if you just Google Bonfire, American Socioside, or my name.
Okay.
And
we'll put a link to the page,
and
the publisher
you can
page.
Give me, Aaron. I think people who follow you will find it interesting. Sort of a slightly different angle, but sort of will affirm much of what they thought about, but maybe give them a little bit more hope about some of the possibilities here. Maybe, as you said, for somewhat different reasons than you might offer, but they're very convergent, I think.
Right. I think that the structural forces that are bringing down this political order are fueling its own nemesis internationally and domestically, and I think that you've been pointing to some of these domestic trends.
That puts it very well, yes.
And so I thank you for joining us today, Charles Derber, and I will put the link to the book in the show notes, and thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me, Aaron. I really enjoy talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I want to express my deepest appreciation to all of our American Exception subscribers. If you are not a subscriber, please consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Thank you for tuning in and helping us bring light to the devil's chessboard.